Under coverture, when a woman got married, her legal rights and obligations were. So a couple of days ago, I did that video where I was talking about the history of coverture laws. And basically what happened was, under coverture, a man and a woman were one once they got married, but the woman lost her legal identity. She became one with him. She had no legal rights, no legal right to property, no legal right to her own money. She became his property, and he could do what he wanted to with his property. That's the reason why there were no repercussions or consequences for DV. There's no issue with marital rape, because how can you harm your own property? These women belong to men. And so that leads me to this conversation about women getting institutionalized by their husbands, in that part of history that we don't talk about nearly enough. Before I get into that article, I want to talk to you about this book that I read a couple of years ago, Women in Madness by Phyllis Chesler. This gives an amazing history of women getting institutionalized, and how the whole institution, the medical field, psychology, has been male dominated, white male dominated, and how they have weaponized medicine and psychology to harm women and people of color in general. So this is an amazing book to check out. Okay, back to the article. So this is a pretty good article from the Reader's Digest from March 2022, The Shocking History of Female Asylums. Did you know that for centuries being female was classed as a mental disorder? Dr. Jessica Taylor shares the surprising history. Being female was literally classified as a mental disorder for centuries. Women had always been described by philosophers, scientists, and physicians as defective, deformed, mutated versions of men. Sexism is built into the cake of some sciences. Understand that. And so a lot of sciences are not neutral, because they stem from a lot of this thinking. This is where the male as default thinking comes from, which plagues science to this day. Women were described as problematic, with a range of mental and physical disorders that men couldn't or wouldn't decipher. By the 18th century, one of the most common psychiatric diagnoses used to control, imprison, and violate women was that of hysteria. The word and concept of hysteria is thought to originate from the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates, who wrote that the uterus was a problematic organ. Hysteria was described as a female disease caused by women's wombs detaching from their usual position and floating around the body, causing havoc in the brain, heart, and other organs, hence the term wandering womb syndrome. Hysterical women were described as responding in disproportionately emotional ways to life and daily events, hence the modern term hysterical. Hysteria was complete nonsense, of course, but as doctors of that era had no scientific training and were steeped in racism and misogyny whilst holding significant local and national authority, like they do today, like the politicians of today. They hold these, I'm sorry. Let's keep it. No one sought to question the validity of an entire reproductive organ detaching itself and then moving around the female body, causing insanity and emotional unrest. All right. Until 1980, this was still considered to be a legitimate medical and psychiatric condition listed in the DSM, which could be cured by medication, treatment, and therapy. And pre-1970, women were told to use dildos, have hunch with men, and become pregnant, or have womb extractions as a cure for their hysteria. Read that again if you missed it. An interesting mix of cures, you may notice, especially for the time period. Doctors invented vibrators and dildos as a medical treatment for hysterical and insane women, whilst natural female self-pleasure was described as self-abuse and used to diagnose women with further psychiatric disorders. At the same time, doctors would prescribe marriage to single women who were diagnosed as mentally ill, as women were seen to need the control and authority of a man to keep them in line. Once her life was on track as a submissive wife and mother, she would be well again. in the 19th century and early 20th century, women were committed to asylums for anything that men found remotely offensive, from novel reading to imaginary female troubles. According to the historical records from the West Virginia Hospital for the Insane, 1899, women were treated with a range of dangerous procedures for insanity symptoms such as studying, not hunching enough with their husbands, not smiling enough, being interested in politics, self-pleasure, and overusing their limited female mental powers, thinking too much. Women were the main recipients of almost all of the most dangerous and fatal psychiatric treatments, including electroconvulsive therapy, frontal lobotomies, and insulin therapies, right through to the end of the 1960s. Women with a range of psychiatric diagnoses were prescribed forced womb extractions and forced sterilizations in psychiatric hospitals. It's hard to ignore the centuries of misogyny which underpin psychiatry, and in the ways that in which any women, did not conform to the expected standards set by men, were quickly positioned as mentally ill and in need of treatment or isolation from society. This literally did not start to change until the 1970s, when women started asserting themselves and actually demanding rights. Women had to actually fight for rights. Women in this country were second-class citizens, and we don't get enough of this history, just like we don't get enough civil rights history, because when you learn about these types of things, the racism and the misogyny and sexism baked into the cake of America, they call it woke, to get the real history of America. But women and non-white people were literally second-class citizens. And obviously we know that non-white people were second-class citizens, but all women were subject to these sexist and misogynistic laws. In 2017, Helena Bonham Carter starred as Eleanor Rice in the film 55 Steps. It told the true story of Eleanor's life and death at the hands of the psychiatric system in the United States between 1970 and 1991. When she was 25 years old, she was diagnosed with schizophrenia and heavily medicated using forced injections, which caused her serious physical symptoms and illness. At the time, she had no right to refuse antipsychotic medication, sedatives, or any other forced treatments. She was often restrained by several men, pinned to the floor, and injected with drugs that she had no knowledge of and had never consented to. When challenged, doctors would say that patients in psychiatric hospitals were so delusional and disordered that they could not make informed decisions about their care, and therefore their consent was not required. Eleanor was persistent, though, and contacted human rights lawyers who were interested in taking on cases of the most vulnerable and oppressed people. In 1989, after a prolonged and controversial set of hearings and appeals, the courts ruled that people in psychiatric care should be given the right to refuse treatment and should be given full information about the medication and treatment they are being given. And this woman eventually died. She was subjected to so much medicine and harm that she died at 47. Women could typically be institutionalized if they were not feminine enough or didn't fit into the roles that men put upon them. Because, like I said, this was medicine, psychiatric treatments, all of that was heavily white male dominated. So you had to conform in those days. And husbands could just want to get rid of their wives, and they could claim any of these things. This was reason to get rid of them. Hysteria was a good catch-all to just institutionalizing women. Greed, laziness, domestic trouble, religious enthusiasm, excessive SA done to her. If she was a SA, she could get put into an insane asylum. Imaginary female trouble as decided by men. And y'all could keep reading some of this. Bad habits, bad company, vicious vices, and all of these come down to the opinions of men and men's opinions. So be glad that we're living right now, because the way women were treated not even that long ago was atrocious. And be thankful for the rights that you have right now. Anyways, jump in the comments. Let me know what you think. like, comment.